let's begin with regular order, because and it might be the least likely thing that they're going to get to right now. But at some point, at this point of the year, you usually think of them beginning the appropriations bills for next year, for fiscal year 2023, which begins in October. So they really haven't gotten off to much of a start yet, but let's just tee up that little part of regular order, because before we get to all the supplementals, how do you see the appropriations process playing out this year?
Yeah, I think there's just no chance that they move bills through regular order this year. I mean, I don't even think they're trying that hard. Mm-hmm. They just wrapped up the appropriations process for fiscal year 22. We're about halfway through the fiscal year, and they just finished legislating here in March with the full year appropriations bill. And I just think that the reality is their ambitions aren't that great this year. They don't have a budget. They don't have the top line numbers to even build an appropriations bill around. And with the political elections coming up in November, there's just not a huge incentive to work together. So I think probably what you get is a CR, continuing resolution, that they'll push, post the August recess in October. That could be a venue for litigating some of the unsettled issues that you mentioned, for example, COVID aid or Title 42, which is this requirement that they expel migrants from Mexico on public health grounds. But beyond that, I just think it's really unlikely that they get anything done. The Democrats probably lose the House in the elections, and they come back and try to, put the pieces back together in December and see if they can agree on something then.
And probably no budget resolution this year, you think?
I'd be shocked. I mean, I don't even think they have the votes for it. I mean, maybe you could pass one in the House. I don't know why you'd bother trying, but with no agreement around Build Back Better, no real agreement around what to do on taxes, and kind of the potential for a looming recession, I don't think they have the votes, the 50 votes they need in the Senate to pass something. And I'd be surprised if they had the 218 they need to pass something in the House. So this is just a function of Congress being so evenly divided. I mean, we've never had a Senate that's been 50-50 for this long, and it's really difficult to legislate in a normal 50-50 Senate. But the Democrats have the added disadvantage of their 50th Senator, Joe Manchin, being from a really Republican state. So the guy's got just very little incentive to cooperate with anything they want to do.
And just before, because Tori wants to get into the supplemental stuff, which is really where the action is at the moment. But I can't help but lament, as an old timer, the total breakdown of the budget process, and the fact that budget resolutions are only intended now to get reconciliation instructions. And it used to be, I mean, there really was a time when the budget resolution was a big deal, and it wasn't considered optional. But now it's broken down. I don't know what we do about that, and I'm not really. That's not the subject of this show. But
yeah, I mean, I think the 74 Budget Act has really failed to achieve its goals. It's obsolete at this point. The deadlines are routinely ignored, as you point out. And, I think you're right. It's only used now to unlock reconciliation. So we're on a path that eventually the filibuster probably goes away in the Senate within the next 10 years. And once the filibuster is gone, reconciliation will even be not important anymore. Right. So I think that this is, you need we've gone through eras of government reform in the past, military reform, pension reform, budget reform, and you're going to need some external trigger to force a reform in the budget process. And I think we're very far away from that. We're not close to having that happen now. But the budget law is really not serving its function anymore. And most of the spending is on autopilot now.
Right. So I just want to ask a follow-up question on the appropriations process. This is one thing that's got me noodling and sitting up at night staring at the ceiling. If the Republicans do take one or both chambers in the November elections, does Congress try and get their homework done, get all the appropriations bills done, like in a giant omnibus before they go home at the end of the year, before Christmas? Or do Republicans try and force a continuing resolution into next calendar year, 2023? Because at that point, they'll control at least one of the pens and be able to, help draft the legislation. Do you see them finishing up their work before the end of the year, or does this get pushed into next year like it did this year?
Yeah, I mean, there's always competing theories of the case here, right? So sometimes you've got minorities coming into the majority who argue, well, look, let's just clear the decks. We don't want to have to deal with this first thing next year.
Mhm.
And then other times you've got people who say, look, we want to be in control. We want the pen. And that'll be a division within the Republicans. If you look at previous election cycles like 2018, where the House majority flipped from Democrat to Republican, from Republican to Democrat, the appropriations bills weren't finished until early in 2019. And that's, the Democrats came in, they wanted to have a role in writing their own laws. Now, these appropriations bills tend to be pretty bipartisan. So there's input from both sides that will be reflected. I suspect that'll be the case this year as well. I think one interesting dynamic that's happening right now is you've got inflation eroding away at the federal government's spending power. And you also have a war in Ukraine, which is really helping kind of fueling a resurgence in concern about the need to fully and completely and perhaps excessively fund national security. And so you've got Republicans who are out there saying they want to see the Department of Defense budget increase by 5% over the rate of inflation. So if inflation is 8% this year, that means you're going to get 13% increase in the Department of Defense. Well, that doesn't come free. If you want that, you have to be willing to do a deal on the domestic discretionary spending. And this deal can happen no matter who's in power. It's really just a function of kind of how willing members are to come back in town in November and December after they've lost a tough election, and how willing they are to do a deal at that point. And that's kind of the unknown variable at this point. My guess is, like previous election cycles where somebody loses the House, you end up kicking this into next year, but there could be a really strong impetus to get it done now.